The Mandalorian Season 3 was kind of screwed over by the Book of Boba Fett, kind of like how I screwed over Taco Bell's totally authentic and totally tasty Mexican cuisine whenever I want to tell a cheap joke. But on the other hand, that food is cheap too, so I'm just being fair here. See, in the previous season of The Mandalorian, i.e. in The Mandalorian Season 2, the story was left open-ended. In the conclusion of that season, the titular Mandalorian named Din Djarin, played by Pedro Pascal, i.e. everyone's favorite internet daddy, defeats the antagonist in Giancarlo Esposito's Imperial asshole Moff Gideon. Din reveals his face, meaning that our beloved Mandalorian strayed from his Mandalorian culture and is now labeled an apostate and is banished from the cult that is formed up by his faithful helmeted brethren as if he named names at an anonymous orgy. Which, to be fair, hey, we have all been there. And he grew closer together with Grogu, i.e. Baby Yoda, all to the point that Din now views himself as Grogu's fatherly figure because, as we all know, Pedro Pascal is the daddy protector of the realm. But this is a problem given that by the end of Season 2, Din, against his own desires and wants, hands Grogu over to creepy CGI Luke Skywalker so that Grogu can learn the ways of the Force, all while fortifying his diaper with green forceful shits. And as a result, Din was left alone. And with all of these different narrative threads, Din Djarin potentially had an intriguing arc for a prospective Season 3. The showrunners had a lot of character real estate to work with when it came to crafting up a follow-up season for our lovely protagonist. Yet, unfortunately, that effort was undermined by the Book of Boba Fett, a show that featured Boba Fett making a fool of himself, a show that sucked, a show that sadly kind of acted as Season 2.5 of The Mandalorian. See, the best parts of the Book of Boba Fett, particularly in the back half, were when it sidelined its ineffectual fool of a main character, i.e. the guy that was once known for being cool, in favor of Din Djarin and Grogu as, over the course of a few episodes, they reunite and Grogu abandons the way of the Force, which was a surprise, though given that his teacher had the cold and calculating look of someone who only exclusively listens to Dream Theater, I could hardly blame the little green guy. And by the end of the Book of Boba Fett, Din Djarin and Grogu become a loving, albeit unconventional family, which is adorbs. However, there is an issue here. See, Din's and Grogu's presence in the Book of Boba Fett wrapped up many of the unresolved threads from Season 2, meaning that the recently released Mandalorian Season 3 had a lot less to work with when it came to character development. Hell, the Book of Boba Fett concluded Season 2's most interesting plot element that was left dangling in how Din and Grogu are ultimately reunited, and due to this, the Mandalorian Season 3 had to reset the stakes. After all, the only plot thread from the end of Season 2 that remained unresolved was in how Din must travel to the cursed planet of Mandalore, i.e. the Mandalorian homeworld that fell to the onslaught of the Empire Armada, and bathe in its waters in order to redeem himself among those he considers to be his peers, i.e. those who view him as an apostate due to removing his helmet and showing his beautiful face, which is a crime that is unfair toward Pedro Pascal, because we all love the noggin of that aforementioned internet papa. But still, this is what keeps the plot moving forward. This is the show's and characters' narrative motivation. Yet, this is a problem, mostly because Din's quest to cure himself of moral impurity just isn't very interesting, especially compared to the character relationship between Din and Grogu that was resolved in the Book of Boba. It's just not as good. And honestly, the showrunners knew that Din's religious redemption arc wasn't all that strong. After all, The Mandalorian Season 3 had to do a reset and had to rebuild the stakes of its narrative. Like in the first episode alone, we the audience are reintroduced to characters like Carl Weathers' Magistrate Greef Karga and Katie Sackhoff's Royal Mandalorian in Bo-Katan Kryze. And while sure, the first episode clunkily puts these characters into their narrative places in ineloquent, rapid-fire succession, these character placements do eventually serve the purpose of adding narrative elements that were desperately needed in order to deliver a more nuanced story. They were necessary. With that being said though, The Mandalorian Season 3's execution is sloppy here, mostly because Din and Grogu's relationship are not the main narrative or thematic focus of Season 3. In fact, when it comes to The Mandalorian Season 3's narrative, they are placed into the back seat. The story instead favors Bo-Katan Kryze, and this is an issue, especially seeing as Din and Grogu are the heart and soul of the show. Hell, Din is the titular Mandalorian in The Mandalorian. Yet Din and Grogu's relationship are narratively and thematically sidelined in their own story. In fact, in Season 3, they are devalued and should have been written to be more than just supporting characters, because unfortunately that's what they are here, even despite having a lot of screen time. They support the narrative and other characters rather than lead, because in The Mandalorian Season 3, Bo-Katan is the actual main character here. And while yes, let me be clear, Bo-Katan's narrative and character arc is interesting, hence why she has the biggest narrative arc of any character this season, Din and Grogu just aren't the stories or the thematic focus of this season, which is a disservice to these characters who were previously The Mandalorian's primary appeal. Like, don't get me wrong, Bo-Katan is cool as shit, but the heart of the show is the father-child bond between Din and Grogu, something that is unfortunately narratively diminished compared to previous seasons. And sure, there are moments where Din and Grogu's character development do advance the plot, but they are no longer tied to the central conflict, like the first 2 seasons were about Din protecting Grogu from the Empire and potentially delivering him to nightmare fuel Luke Skywalker, all while the two of them became emotionally attached to one another. Whereas Season 3's conflict revolves around Bo-Katan and the Mandalorian culture as a whole, which, as fun as that can be, it does ultimately diminish Din's and Grogu's narrative relevance. Their presence and character development has less purpose this season. Still, The Mandalorian Season 3 still has its merits. As stated earlier, Bo-Katan is a cool character, and there's cool sci-fi blaster fights featuring Mandalorians in jetpacks and nifty Beskar armor. It's just still fun to be had in The Mandalorian Season 3. But honestly, I just desired for the main conflict to be more connected to Din and Grogu's character development. That's the main plot could be tethered to these two characters in a meaningful way, like how it was done in Seasons 1 and 2. I just wish Din and Grogu received more focus. And with that, that was the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please leave a like rating, share, subscribe, ring the bell, and leave a comment telling me what you thought of The Mandalorian Season 3. Additionally, you should come check out my Patreon page. $1 a month gets you under this credit sequence, and $5 a month allows you to make a review or impressions requests. The link to my Patreon is in the description. And speaking of Patreon, I just want to thank my patrons, particularly my high tier ones in Samantha Devlin, Mom, and Morgan. Thank you so much for supporting what I do. Love y'all.